Hey, everybody. It's Weird Islanders, the podcast, back once again. My name is Dan. That is Mike. How are you this evening, Mike?
I'm doing very well. I'm pretty excited to talk about a season and a player who we revisit every once in a while. I mean, the season where we certainly revisit basically once a week, but this player's name comes up quite a bit, and he's got quite a journey that takes you places and will reach into your soul because of not what he did with the Islanders, which wasn't much, but what happened to him afterwards. And it's a very, very interesting kind of situation. Plus, this is also a player that I think has one of those hockey names, especially like
Mm,
during the dead puck era. This was a guy who was like, he's got a cool name. It would be really cool if the Islanders ever got a guy with like a name like this. Obviously, they had Ziggy Falfy, and then after he left, I was like, we need a name, and this was a really hockey like dead puck era name that I feel like it would come up on ESPN too, like on NHL Tonight. They loved saying this name, and I would,
yeah.
I loved it too, and it was very coolest game on earth. So I'm really, yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah. Cool name, cool look, cool player for a couple of teams. Not the Islanders, but we're going to get into all of that with our guest. This is a player who we've kind of danced around a lot. But we finally have we finally are ready to give him his due, and to do that, we needed an expert. We brought in one. He is the internet news manager for Newsday. He's a columnist for Hockey Hot Stove, and the author of not one but two books about the Washington Capitals: Red Rising, the Washington Capitals story, and Transition Game, the story of the 2010-2011 Washington Capitals. He is Ted Starkey. Ted, how are you this evening?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on. You have, again, written two books about the Caps, but you've worked for Newsday for a number of years now. Do you still feel like you're kind of living behind enemy lines a little bit here, or have you assimilated fully into Islanders culture yet?
Well, it's always different because I've been around sports for almost forever, and so you get kind of get used to it. But
Mm.
it's been interesting because I got here right at the end of the Coliseum era, first part. Then
Yeah.
covered games obviously at Barclays, which is I'm sure is experience in itself.
Oh, yeah.
And then obviously Coliseum too, and now UBS. I'm excited. I'm doing Hockey Hot Stove, so I'm doing some stuff at UBS this year. So excited to
Mm.
be back in the press box, and the Islanders are fun to watch.
Yeah. You got the full Islanders arena tour, so
Exactly,
you're very lucky.
exactly, exactly. I mean, I was lucky enough to be there during the 2019 playoff against Pittsburgh, and
Right.
the building was shaking, and during the series against Tampa Bay a couple years ago. So, yeah, no,
That's great.
it's it's fun. It's a similar fan base to Washington. It started out
Mhm.
suburban. Obviously, they're Caps made a little bit more inroads in the city because they're actually in the city, but obviously the Islanders are trying to, kind of bleed into the New York market a little bit more than they had been. But obviously, it's
Right.
great that they have a new building, and you don't have to worry about any of those other questions about the franchise.
Tell me about it. Mike and I spent the first like 5 years of our podcast
I know
talking
you
about
guys
that.
have lived it, so
Yeah. Yeah, we're very well aware.
yeah, I have plenty of Islander fans, and I know there's a lot of angst
Right.
over the years. So
Mm.
it's good that it means a lot to have the franchise
Yeah.
here. I think they've obviously got a lot of history. I've seen a lot of the Islander history. I was actually at the Easter Epic
Oh, wow.
and the Mick Vukota hat trick games. So
Wow.
I saw a lot of I saw a lot of games in
Yeah.
Landover. So
Gee.
many involving the Islanders in the old Patrick Mission
Yeah.
days. But it's a fun
Yeah.
it's a fun team now to
Yeah.
watch. It was a great rivalry back in the days. It's funny now. I see some of the old Islander veterans, and get to know them a little
Mm.
bit. So
Yeah.
it's fun.
Wow. That might be the weirdest Islander game of all time, the Mick Vukota hat trick game.
It was bizarre. It was you're kind of like, because the thing is, Vakota was actually a Caps farmhand for a
Right.
while. And so, like, he knew all the players on the other side, and you're like, man, he
That's really,
scored
really
one.
funny.
What? He scored twice. Got a hat trick. What the heck? So, but yeah, it was funny.
Yeah, I remember that.
Like I said, between that and Pat LaFontaine, I've seen plenty of Islander moments.
Two players on the absolute opposite end of the talent spectrum right there. But we are going to here to
Exactly.
talk. We're here to talk about a guy who is a Capitals legend, and I'm sure you saw many games of. He also happens to be a Montreal Canadiens legend, which is kind of weird for me because I always picture him as a Capital. We'll get into all that in a minute. He also turns out to be kind of a low-key Florida Panthers legend. which we'll talk about too.
Yep.
But he's also definitely a weird Islander. In fact, an extremely weird Islander, as Mike and I have talked about, for years. But we're probably going to get the full story. So, Ted Starkey, will you please reveal the subject of tonight's episode of Weird Islanders, the podcast?
Well, he was a key in 10 games for the 2006-2007 New York Islanders. 1 goal and 2 assists in 10 games. It is Richard Zednik.
That's right. It's time for Richard Zednik. We're going to get into all of his many stops and his 10 games with the Islanders. Before we do that, reminder that we are on Patreon at patreon.com/IslandersAnxiety. Membership gets you ad-free episodes, bonus podcasts, written posts, access to our chats, and a whole lot more. You can also join for free to get our weekly release calendar or try a 7-day free trial of our country club tier. So sign up today any way you can, patreon.com/IslandersAnxiety. Okay, Ted. This is, probably predates your time as a writer and as a journalist, but can you go back and remember the first time you experienced Richard Zednik, spectacular late 90s, early 2000s hockey player?
I think, really, he came on the scene in Washington in the 97-98 season, which is the first season the Caps made it to the Stanley Cup final. He basically, he was a 10th round draft pick, 249th overall, neither of which exists today. But he spent a couple.
I love when guys are like 10th round draft picks.
It's crazy. I mean, people don't realize he used to have all these rounds, but so he bounced around. He was in Portland for 2 years. He went to the Calder, deep in the Calder playoffs with the Pirates 1 year. But really, 07 or 97, 98 was his first big year. He's kind of legendary because he only scored 19 goals that year, but he scored 17 goals this year, excuse me. But he scored 2 goals in the last game at US Air Arena in Landover, which is the Caps' first home. He scored 2 goals in the first game at what was then MCI Center, now known as Capital One Arena. He also scored a goal in every round of the playoffs when the Caps went to the finals. And he also is forever going to be known as the guy who first scored Washington's first goal at Verizon Center, Capital One Arena, and in the Stanley Cup final in Game 1 against the Detroit Red Wings at the Joe. So he had made the most of his 17 goals.
Yeah, seriously. I didn't realize he was such an enormous part of that 98 Caps team, which I remember really, really well. At least I thought I did. Mike, what about you? This is really your era, late 90s, early 2000s. You talk about, this is when you started to become this Islanders team around this time was really near and dear to your heart. But man, that Capitals team for a little while there was really a lot of fun. It was a veteran team. Again, they went to that Cup final in 98. We'll talk all about that in a few minutes. But do you remember being a young lad and being sort of taken by, again, a guy who really epitomized that era of NHL hockey?
I remember that team. I remember watching that Stanley Cup final pretty vividly. And I remember that playoff run, and I sort of adopted the Capitals as my team. I was 8, and I knew I was an Islander fan, but I also knew that meant that I wasn't going to be. I didn't get a chance. I wasn't going to have a chance to root for the Islanders in the playoffs for a very long time. And and I remember liking, the look was awesome. Obviously, they had Ole the goalie, which was really cool. I had an affinity for Joe Juneau, and just kind of following along with that team, I knew the name Richard Zednik, and I remember that Sabres series because that Sabres team was kind of plucky themselves, and being like, oh, I'm the Capitals. I like the Capitals more than the Sabres. I'm rooting for the Capitals, and I remember being just out in a restaurant watching one of the games against the Sabres, and then so I don't remember what happened in that game or anything, but I do remember this team quite well. But the thing that really jumped out to me when I think about how I looked at Richard Zednik when I was younger was that back in the day, the late 90s especially, those Eastern European countries, they were all going through golden generations. Now we think of these international hockey tournaments, it's going to be Canada or the US. Maybe you get one of the Scandinavian two to put up a charge, Sweden or Finland, and Slovakia and Czechia or the Czech Republic, they're big time sleeper dark horse types. But back then it felt like those teams had all the coolest players, Slovakia especially with Peter Bondra and Richard Zednik. So I remember him being part of that golden generation for Slovakian hockey too. So Yeah, and those guys were all so cool. I mean,
Yeah.
even looking at like the Czechs, like the Czechs were obviously really cool, and all the Slovakian players. Like if you were a Slovakian NHLer, you were cool in the late '90s. You probably
Wow.
were driving a Corvette, like a red Corvette. You probably were dating a model or a tennis player or something. Like you were just really cool, and
Yeah.
they they were so '90s with the hair, the look, a lot of
Yeah.
like the facial hair that these guys wore. They were '90s. They were friends, right? Like that. This was they. If you were a
Right.
hockey fan, they were friends to you, and
Yeah.
so that's where I started to kind of that's how I would my POV on Richard Zednik was, which is why it was such a big deal when the Islanders got him because I was like, wow, man, if you told 9-year-old Michael Leboff that Richard Zednik was going to be an Islander, it'd be like you telling him like prime Sergei Fedorov was going to be an Islander. So
Right.
it was a big deal.
Yeah, and of course, leading the pack of cool Slovakians, cool Euros, was the Islanders' own Ziggy
Right.
Palffy, who was right in
That's
that mix. And but Zednik was a different kind of player. Not obviously a big scorer like Palffy. He would never. I think he wouldn't approach the 40 goal level of Palffy, but he would get there eventually again with his second team, the Montreal Canadiens. But we should talk about the look because while Palffy had the mullet thing going, Zednik had a different look. He had the frosted hair, the blonde hair with like the sort of, I guess for lack of a better word, Nickelback sort of, goatee right on the end of the chin, a very angular looking guy that nonetheless, again, epitomized 90s hockey, looked cool. And like you were saying, Ted, like, I don't know if burst on the scene is really the way to go because he had a couple of cup of coffees before this, but that 98 team, I mean, it's guys like Esa Tikkanen, Dale Hunter, Brian Bellows, Adam Oates, Joey Juneau, Olaf Kolzig. Like these guys had all
Chris
been
Simon with that
Bondra.
long hair.
Yeah, Chris Simon, Callie Johansson. Like these dudes had been around a long time. And it's this like 22-year-old Slovakian guy that shows up and just ends up kind of being in the middle of everything. And, if you had to pick
yeah.
somebody to score the first goal for the Washington Capitals in their history in the Stanley Cup final, I don't know if a lot of people would pick Richard Zednik, but he ends up being like the perfect guy to do that.
When he made the play out, Nikolishkin flipped it in deep. Zednik was in there for Washington, but again it's Detroit. They seem to be outnumbering the Capitals. Here's a chance, Zednik shot, score! Zednik open, got the shot, and rattled it by Chris Osgood. So Washington finally breaks through the armor of Osgood, and are back in the game now, trailing by one.
Well, Zednik, who's been, would have been maybe the rookie of the year if he'd have played the whole season. Zednik keeps it in. That's one of the rare times, and here's the shot. And Osgood gets a bit of it with either his glove hand or the goal stick, but it goes back in behind him. Bondra stops the puck. Nikolishkin stops the puck, finds it and drops it to Zednik, who lets the 31-footer go. And the Washington Capitals, if they ever needed a wake-up call, perhaps Mr. Zednik gave it to him.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think it was interesting about that team. They basically, at the deadline, they picked up Bellows, they picked up Tikkanen, and there weren't a lot of expectations of that team. They're a pretty good
Right.
team. They're pretty good at the Olympic break, but they really got that year was such a weird playoff year. You were talking about Buffalo. Remember, Philadelphia went out in the first round, Pittsburgh went out in the first round, and the Devils went out in the first round. So you're basically, I think it was, believe it was Montreal, Ottawa, Washington, and Buffalo were the final four. And, when are you going to see that?
Mm.
And then you have a guy like Richard
Right.
Zednik. He was like, what I was struck about me, he was his skating style. He looked like a rod hockey player that you just sent forward. He looked like the Johnny Canuck Vancouver logo on ice. He kind of lumbered along, but he was really fast north to south. He wasn't necessarily the best finisher, but when you saw him skate, you knew exactly who it was. Like, I'd be watching a random game he was involved in. I'd say, "Oh, there he is." But yeah, that was an interesting
Right.
team. I mean, everything kind of went together at the right moment for them. They had just, they moved into the downtown arena that year. Basically, they were okay to the Olympic break, and then after the Olympic break, Ole Kolzig really started to take off. He had a great playoff for the Caps. Bellows is really good, and another trivia question: future Islander Kiefer Bellows is born during that series. Brian took a day off between games 1 and 2, and he was born that in between. So it's Islanders connection everywhere.
I was working for Stan Fischler at this time as an intern for the Fischler Hockey Service, and I just remember watching these playoffs, and I was actually really pulling for the Islanders that year. That was the Trevor Linden year. We'll get back to actually Trevor Linden in a little bit in this episode, but I really thought they had the juice to make the playoffs that year, and of course they did not, and they wouldn't for quite a while. But I remember when the Caps made it, and they I guess did they beat Buffalo or did they beat Ottawa that year?
They went they beat Buffalo to get to the Cup final. They basically started off against Boston, fell back 2-1, but won that series in overtime at TD Garden. Second series is basically all Kolzig. They won in 5. Basically, he was on lights out against the Senators, and of course, the Eastern Finals. You had him against Hasek at his peak. Remember the Sabres made it next year,
right?
But it was basically Joe Juno, but still Zed had a 2-goal game in that series. Helped Washington. Finally get. They were always the cursed franchise. They'd never been to the Stanley Cup final. The closest they got was 1990, but by then they were. They reached the Wales final at the time against the Bruins, but they were so beat up at the time. They lost half their defense and they lost in 4 straight. So it was a big deal. Everything came together. It was like the year before they missed the playoffs. And of course, the year after they missed the playoffs. So it was really kind of a 1 year, everything came together for them that year.
Yeah. Like Chris Simon in particular had that one big year. But no, I just remember telling Stan after that series against the Sabres, I was just like, because as you just said, the Caps had never been that far, only had made it even almost that far one time and got, blown out. I just remember looking at him and saying like, I can't believe the Washington Capitals in the Stanley Cup Finals. And he just was like, what are you going to do? It was going to happen at some point. And I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. But of course, they run up against the basically dynastic Red Wings. They get swept in 4 straight games. But again, Zednik had a hell of a playoff. This is a guy who's 22 years old, 17 games in the playoffs. He has 7 goals and 3 assists or 10 points. That's awesome. Like, that's ridiculous.
And he got, big thing is he got time on the power play, which obviously, some of these teams were, especially Buffalo, they did not give a lot of room on the power play. And, he was able to basically, he fit right in. They had a fun, fast team. They were probably, more similar to a team you'd see in recent years than you would in the 90s. Bondro had a ton of speed. Zednik had a ton of speed. Bondra had more finish. But then, they added guys like Bellows who were kind of, veteran leadership. They just, it all came together.
Oates, I remember that trade was a huge one.
Yep. Yeah. And, it's, Kolzig was he was the reason they made the finals because he was lights out basically after the first round until, obviously. And the thing was weird is, with Detroit, remember that's the year Chris Osgood gave that half-ice shot against Dallas. So, obviously now looking at Detroit, we see that was such a dynastic team. This is a team that was coming off, 97, they beat Philly. But Philly, we weren't sure what they were made of. And, they still had Chris Osgood in net. Another Islander again. We keep circling back to former Islanders. But, he almost let that, I believe it was game 5. Everyone was like, well, is, Dallas going to win? And upset Detroit, but obviously it didn't turn out that way. I mean, the game Zednik scored in, they hung it. It was the first game in Detroit. They went down 2-0. Zednik, made it close, so he got his name on the score sheet. Game 2 is the one that will always live in infamy in Washington because they had the lead on Detroit and ended up losing in overtime, and that was basically the end of the series. After that, they played 2 games at home.
Right. I remember that. Yeah.
And to add insult to injury, the former owner of the Capitals had a marketing person who decided it would be a great idea to sell tickets to Detroit travel agency for the final. And so it was absolutely overrun with Detroit fans. It was, I remember.
That's awful.
Yeah. It was an executive. She worked for the Bullets before. And her marketing campaign would be something akin to, come see the Chicago Bulls and the Bullets. Come see the Boston Celtics and the Bullets. So we kind of got, I think Mickey Redmond had a travel
Right.
agency, and
That's pretty funny.
I had a wad of cash, and so there was a lot of Detroit fans. So it was kind of
Mm.
a disappointing end to what was a really fun run.
That's fine. I mean, that's fine on like a Tuesday night. If you need to sell tickets and Chicago's in town with Michael
Right.
Jordan, that's great. But the Stanley Cup final, you don't want to see that.
People showed up in the box office, and there were notes that you had to buy season tickets to get Stanley Cup final tickets.
Yeah.
And, it's like, that's terrific. Fans have been waiting for, 20, 24 years to get to the finals, and this is how you treat them.
Awful. Yeah, Mike, this was a fun team, and you said you kind of attach yourself to them as a young fan. Did that continue at all after this? Because like Ted said, I'll never forget too. This team made the finals and then missed the playoffs the next year. It was. I remember going to a game. I actually went to an Islanders Caps game. Actually, not that year. It was the year after. I guess they made the playoffs and then lost in the first round. But this golden age of Capitals hockey did not last particularly long. But Zednik was still there and ended up having a couple of good years we'll talk about. But did you end up following this guy after that season?
No, I mean that's kind of just like your lot in life as an Islander fan was like you the playoffs start and you just pick a team and they just happen to be the team I picked that year. Right. and that was just like the most 90s playoff series ever, because as Ted was saying, like the way like the Eastern Conference spit out, it was in the East it was a crapshoot and a bunch of people wearing crazy jerseys, and you were either gonna get mauled by the Avalanche or the Red Wings in the Stanley Cup final. Like that's kind of like what it felt like. So like you had the Capitals in their crazy jersey, the Senators still were wearing like their 2-dimensional ones, but they were very interesting to look at, especially in like the 90s. The Bruins were wearing whoever knows back then. I don't think that they had they had the meth bear like shoulder patch at that point. And then so it was just, and then you got to the Stanley Cup final, and whoever is still had was still breathing between the Avs and the Red Wings were just waiting for you. And that was just such a 90s playoff series, and I think that that's really what how I just have viewed Richard Zednik. And you keep bringing up, I think Palffy is like he was like the poor man Ziggy in a lot of ways to me.
A little bit,
like and Ziggy but as an Islander fan, you loved him, and you're like, when he left, it was just bone crushing, and but he was so cool, and then you look at Zednik, and he was like just like a little more subtle with his cool. But they're both these Slovakian stars who were massive in their country too, and probably still are. I'm sure Richard Zednik is still a pretty big deal in his homeland, because that's just how they treat these guys. But then then his Capitals career moves, because he moves on, I guess, from the Caps for the first time, and I think you think of him as a Capital. I kind of think of him as a Capital, but I do remember him very well as a Canadian, and to wear a letter for the Montreal Canadiens as a especially not as a like French Canadian player when you weren't there that long, it's pretty impressive. Like he had more than a cup of coffee with the Canadiens. He was there for 3 or 4 seasons or whatever it was, and he wore a letter. So like that's usually there. You have to like earn that status by your passport, and then by playing tons of games for the Canadiens and making your mark. So seeing Zednik get there and then become wearing a letter for those Canadiens teams that had some, those the Koivu teams, and they were good, and they had characters on them. So he's his, maybe like I because of the way his Islander tenure went, I like underestimated his overall impact on the game, and I just thought of him as this like 90s cool guy who then ended up with the Islanders for a cup of coffee, and then obviously the stuff that happened that we'll talk about later.
And now a word from our sponsors. VintageIceHockey.com. Over 100 classic hockey logos on t-shirts, jerseys, hats, mugs, and more. Long Island Ducks, Albany Riverettes, Danbury Trashers, Kentucky Thoroughblades, and so many more. Plus a full line of Islanders Anxiety merch, with our portion of the sales going directly to the Center for Dementia Research. These incredible items cannot be found in stores, so shop VintageIceHockey.com today. Relax, sit back, and enjoy wine from The Pinot Project. Rosé, Pinot Grigio, or a Pinot Noir that was named a Best Buy by Wine Enthusiast magazine. These wines are delicious, affordable, and available at area wine shops and at UBS Arena. Learn more at thepinotproject.com, and please drink responsibly. He had a really wonderful NHL career. He ended up having 17 goals that age 22 season. Again, then in the really good playoff run. I guess he was hurt or whatever for the next season.
Yep.
Only had 9 goals.
Yeah, pretty much everyone was injured that year. That's, they basically, I think they went back into the 70s in terms of points, and they, it was basically, it basically short circuited what they had the year before. Everything that went right for them went wrong. And, but he became, he's still very popular. Like I said, his skating style, he was kind of a electric sort of player.
Right.
As I said, he had speed. His hands were great. So, he would get breakaways and miss the net, but, he's exciting, and a lot of fans liked him.
It's funny, everything that went right last year went wrong this year is basically the story of the Capitals pre Alex Ovechkin, even post Alex Ovechkin too, a little bit. But then he rebounded with 19 goals the next year, 35 points. Again, a really good season. But then the year after that, 2000-2001, he gets traded to Montreal, as Mike alluded to before. And this is actually kind of a big trade. He gets traded by Washington with a first-round pick, which ends up being Alexander Paris-Hogan, and Jan Bulis. Talk about another early 2000s player. Jan Bulis would become a legend with the Canucks. To the Montreal Canadiens for a second-round pick, which ended up getting later traded to Tampa Bay. Dinas Zubris, another favorite of mine, would go on to play for the Flyers for a little bit, and former Islanders captain Trevor Linden. We never do this, but because we have you, Ted, and because you're an expert on this, please give us your thoughts on Washington weird capital Trevor Linden, because I know we did an episode on him. We kind of pushed our rule. Usually our rule is like, the guy has to have played for less than a year with the Islanders, but we kind of made a little bit of an exception for Trevor because it was like a year and a half, and I was just a fan, so I wanted to talk about him. But Washington capital Trevor Linden didn't even last that long.
No,
I'm curious about what his legacy is in Washington.
Well, like you were alluding to, they didn't have a lot of success following '98. They missed the playoffs the next year. The year after that, they lost to Pittsburgh, and so I think they were looking for someone in a different direction. They wanted something different in the playoffs. They had done it, a couple times before. Yeah. Let's get a veteran in the locker room and see what happens. And he just was not a good fit. I mean, I was a big Trevor Linden fan before he came to Washington. As obviously, I watch a lot of those Canucks teams. He was always a very exciting player, but he was a lousy fit. I mean, he did not do much for Washington. That was, I believe that was the weird playoff year where, I may be right, maybe the year before, but there's one playoff year where Pittsburgh actually got the first couple games of the playoffs because they had an event at the Civic Arena. And so the Caps were forced to play game 1 on the road, even though they're the better team. But basically, Pittsburgh owned them for so long. They won one of their series in '94, but they lost '95, they lost '96, they lost 2000, 2001, and they were looking for something different. And I think Zednik, his role in Washington, obviously, I think stat-wise, he's a lot more successful in Montreal, but that's also because he got a lot more ice time, he got a lot more opportunity. Yeah. I think Washington, there was a little bit of a numbers game. Right. Obviously the one year he was hurt, but then they kind of retooled. They won the mighty Southeast Division, and then, Kolzig was tremendous. So I think they felt like, we need to go a little bit more veteran heavy with this lineup. And, it really backfired on him because, ironically, Zubris is a better player for Washington in that trade.
That's pretty funny. I was always a fan of Dinas Zubris, but when I saw that, I was like, man, I completely forgot that Zednik was traded for Trevor Linden. That's right. I mean, weird. If we ever get a Canadiens guest on here, we'll ask them about, weird Canadian Trevor Linden as well. But I guess it was a little bit the same with the Islanders. Like, I was a huge fan of his coming here, and the guy tried his best, but like this team just didn't have it. And then he gets traded to Montreal, and I just don't think it was a fit there. It wasn't a fit in Washington, but finally they put it right, and he went back to Vancouver, where he probably should never have left in the first place.
I was gonna say he's kind of like a kind of player who, like, if you have talent around him, I think he can be very
Yeah.
effective. If you're kind of expecting him to drive the team himself, you're probably not going to be overly
Right. Well, I
thrilled.
mean, and his, in his younger days, but by the time he got to our teams, that did not work. But this trade did open up the era of Montreal Canadiens, Richard Zednik, and as you said, he got a lot more ice time, and I was shocked because, again, in my mind, I picture Richard Zednik with the Nickelback goatee, the blonde hair, and the blue Screaming Eagle Washington Capitals, the blue and black Washington Capitals Screaming Eagle jersey. I did not realize that he played more games, scored more goals, and had more points in his time with the Montreal Canadiens than he did with the Caps. Although he played 7 years with the Caps again. One year was just one game. Another year was 11 games. But still, I was kind of shocked by this.
I was just going to say, he never got to 20 goals in Washington, and he did it 3 times in Montreal with a 30-goal season. He is, like I said, Zednik in Washington was more kind of the guy on the spot. Montreal, he was just a much more productive player.
Yeah, 31 goals in 2002, 2003, 26 the year after. I mean, Mike, what do you remember about Richard Zednik, Montreal Canadian? Because honestly, I knew he was there, but I didn't realize he was that productive.
Yeah, he was good. I think his name almost makes him feel like a flashier player than he is. Like, you'd be like Ziggy and Peter Bondra, like they just have these names that you just assume were these were like dynamic Sergei Fedorov-esque type players. But when he came to the Islanders, and then watching like the tail end of his career after he left, because you kind of keep tabs on guys, and that just wasn't. I was like, oh, maybe I just over kind of estimated what we were getting. And then you look back at his numbers with the Canadiens, and like I said before, I mean, he wore a letter for them. He's probably near and dear to the hearts up there if you wear a letter, and just consistent, especially in that era, man. Like right before the lockout, you're scoring 50 points 2 seasons in a row. That's like very impressive stuff. And he also had a bunch of penalty minutes too. So like he wasn't a kind of like the cliche Slovakian skill guy or Eastern European skill guy. Like he had some snarl to him too. And I think this is all kind of like the theme to the episode, which is I was very excited to get Richard Zednik for the Islanders, because not only was he a cool name, that season was such a roller coaster. We've talked about it on Islanders Anxiety, but the Last Days of Bedlam documentary that you need to watch doesn't even mention about the 2006-07 season. 90 minutes long. We don't even mention Zednik, and he was a player that should have had an impact, because you look at who he is, the blonde hair.
Yeah.
Obviously, he didn't bring that with him to the island, but just he should have had an impact, and he just didn't. And in that season, it's probably appropriate that that's how it played out, because it was basically whatever you expected that to happen next that season, the opposite happened. But I think I don't hold it against him in any way, but because I still feel like he's such an NHL character, and I'm happy like there's pictures of him in an Islander jersey. But this is the version of Richard Zednik that I thought the Islanders were getting, right? Like I thought they were going to get this Montreal Canadiens version of him, and it just didn't go that way.
No, it did not. I will tell you this. You are not the only person who thought they were getting the Montreal Canadiens version of Richard Zednik. You know who else thought that? The Washington Capitals, who actually reacquired Zednik just a few years after trading him. In 2007, they traded a 3rd-round pick for him in July of 2006. In July of 2006, they traded a 3rd-round pick to Washington to get Zednik back. He would eventually end that season with the Islanders, but Ted, what do you remember about this? I mean, the Islanders are masters at this, like trading guys away or letting them walk and then reacquiring them, because it's like, you know what, we kind of like that guy. Matt Martin, Steve Webb, other guys have done this before. Like, do you remember the sort of impetus behind that? Did they just want more scoring? And they're like, yeah, that guy we traded seems to be doing that for this other team. Maybe we can get him back.
I think what happened, after the lockout, going into the lockout, the Caps really, they were not shy about tanking. They pretty much traded everything that wasn't nailed down. Obviously, they got rid of Bondra, they got rid of a bunch of other guys, and so coming out of the lockout, obviously you get win the lottery, you get Ovechkin. First year Ovechkin obviously is fantastic. However, he's surrounded by, guys who are basically AHL plus players. I remember,
Mm.
one of his line mates was Chris Clark, and he joked that a fire hydrant could score 30 goals playing with Ovi. But the Cat team that first year teams would basically, the power play would be like one of those magnetic toys for kids. The 4 defenders would just try to surround Ovi and basically dare him to score to someone else to try to score. So
Right.
I think in the next year, I think there was a hope to kind of move towards the playoffs.
Mhm.
Because obviously they were so bad in 04. Besides Ovi, they were not really good in the year out of the lockout. And they were hoping,
Mm.
Zednik was very popular. But
Yeah.
they signed a lot of guys who were, like you said, it is very Islander like. It was guys like, maybe we can get something out of these guys.
Mm.
Very worst, we could end up trading him, which obviously they end up doing. But I just think that was not the most complete team. He only spent 32 games with
Yeah.
the Caps that year. He wasn't quite the best fit, I think, for that team. But obviously he had some
Yeah.
value in the trade market, and that's what ended up happening.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, so his return to Washington was less than triumphant. Yeah, 32 games, 6 goals, 12 assists. And by the trade deadline that year, he was, I guess they were looking to just move him and get some assets for him. And this is where we finally get to Richard Zednik, Weird Islander. He comes to the island for a second round pick, which seems like a bit of a high price to pay for a guy who's only got 6 goals at that point in the season. But again, the promise of Richard Zednik, I think, is probably what Garth Snow was looking at. We're going to get to that second round pick again in a minute. But this was such an odd, a couple of times now we've used the word like wrong fit. And I feel like that's probably the best way to describe Richard Zednik, New York Islander, because the Islanders, it had been a bit of a revolving door that year. They had dudes that were hurt. They started out signing a bunch of free agents. They had a bunch of guys get hurt all year long. By the time the season was over, Rick DiPietro would be out, and Wade Dublowitz and Mike Dunham would be completely ineffective. So who's in net? Wade Dublowitz for the final 4 games of the season, drags them to the playoffs. Obviously, we talked about that 100 times. But for all they had acquired Marc-Andre Bergeron, who we talked about on this show, who was very effective for them. They acquired Ryan Smith, who we've talked about on this show, who was actually, believe it or not, pretty effective for them. But Zednik, of all those like trade deadline guys, was not particularly effective for them. Just 1 goal and 2 assists in 10 games as an Islander. We'll get back to that 1 goal in a minute. But I don't know, Ted, you were the guy who watched more Zednik than either of us at the time before that. Like, do you have maybe a guess as to maybe why it just didn't work? I mean, this season, maybe this was just a lost season for him. We only ended up playing 42 games, scoring 7 goals the whole season. So maybe it just kind of lost for him. But I mean, do you have an idea of why maybe he just didn't fit? I know you probably didn't watch this Islanders team, but like coming from Washington, like maybe do you have a guess like why he just wasn't really working at that point?
I think he really needed a team that could kind of be productive offensively. And obviously that Washington team that year was, besides Ovechkin, was not the most gifted team.
Right.
I think, I remember actually it was at some of the games in that Buffalo series that year. But it just, it was not, he did not seem to be a guy that fit their MO. It's kind of like, in recent years, you've seen guys come in, they don't like that defensive structure that the Islanders used before the season. And I think it was just a similar kind of thing. People always presume you get a guy who's a 30-goal scorer, he'll score 30 goals on every team, and that's not the case. And I think in this case, it's, like I said, he created some chances, but not necessarily a guy who's going to create goals at times. He definitely picked his spots. And, if, you think about, like we were talking about how, productive he was in some of those, 97, 98 team, he still only scored, like 24 goals over that whole season, almost 100 games. So it's not like he was productive every night.
Right.
He was just kind of like when he got hot, he got really hot. And you see even like, going back and looking at his stats, you see, he'll have bunches of goals and then he'll have he didn't have a single point in the series against Buffalo. So it's, I think it just wasn't a great fit. It happens, but the Islanders, I think like you were saying, I think they saw, hey, here's a 30-goal scorer from
Mm,
Montreal, a guy who potentially could be a good playoff player, and it just
yeah.
didn't work out. It it
Yeah.
happens.
Mike, you've said it before. You were all keyed up to get Richard Zednik finally after all these years, and it ends up not being all that, as great as you kind of had expected it in your mind. His one goal for the Islanders came in a 4-3 overtime loss to Tampa Bay. It was Richard. This is a total Michael Leboff goal. Richard Zednik from Randy Robitaille. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Then he now has 97 points. And the puck, it's shot home right off the faceoff. And the Islanders come back and get one on the board. It's 2-1.
Well, I tell you what, you've got to make sure. Randy Robitaille just walked through the middle there, and then it was just hammered by Richard Zednik. And it's put them right back up into one-goal deficit right now, 2:04, just a matter of 14 seconds later. And that is the first goal, if I'm not mistaken, Rick, that Zednik has scored since coming to the Islanders.
Do you remember this goal or this game? And again, what was it about Zednik that just maybe didn't work for that Islanders team? That at that point, what really did work for that team until the final 4 games of the season is really hard for anybody to say. But Zednik definitely did not work for that team.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I do remember that game because it was down that stretch where they just made the big splashes at the deadline, or the big splash at the deadline, and Zednik, of course, gets overshadowed not only by Marc-Andre Bergeron, but then, of course, Ryan Smith, and so he was already there, and he was basically one of the veterans on this team by that point, because it was such a revolving door of just picking up essentially warm bodies off the side of the road to get the Islanders to the finish line, to the point where, we did our Darren Quint episode with special guest Darren Quint, who signed a 5-game contract for the Islanders to close out a season in which they made the playoffs. Like, they make the playoffs in the season with this roster that they put together. And I think that's, part of the reason why that documentary Last Days of Bedlam is such a good watch, is because as Islander fans know, this season is insane and just completely bonkers. This kind of stuff doesn't happen to a team. This amount of crazy things doesn't happen to a sports franchise organization in 20 season. And it happened between July and May of that year. And, Zednik, his Islander arrival and tenure, which was very weird, and we'll get into it, was like the 87th weirdest thing that happened to the Islanders in this season. And and that's what it is so disappointing, but at the same time appropriate, because he joins a team where he probably was like, all these guys are on the, like, Richard Park from the Minnesota Wild is on this team, and Sean Hill, that guy's on the Islanders now. Like, Brendan Witt, my old Capitals teammate, is here. Like, what's going on? Oh yeah, buddy. And we also traded away Alexei Zednik and Mike York. And if you name a random early 2000s or late 90s NHL player, chances are the Islanders had him this season. And you're one of them. Like, you're playing on a team with Victor Kozlov, man. Like, and Randy, you're scoring goals assisted by Randy Robitaille. So it should have worked. It's just, when you think about it, he fit you said it right. It ends up being a bad fit, but on paper it should have been the perfect fit, because the entire identity of this team was just, hey, have you played 500 games in the NHL already in your career, and like kind of are at a crossroads? Yeah. All right, come to Long Island for a season or two, and we'll see where things go. Maybe you're like Richard Park. You find or Mike Sillinger. You have like a little bit of a resurgence. Brendan Witt, you take on this like leadership role, sure. Or you could be like a Mike York or something else, right? Where you just come and go, and we shake hands and don't speak ill of each other afterwards. But Zednik's path was far more bizarre and footnotey. Like, this season, the season had so many insane headline grabbing things that Zednik becomes such a footnote in his tenure, despite scoring a goal in a game and a huge point, helping them get a huge point, being a a big name, and at the time, a second round pick for this guy is a pretty big acquisition, and for that to become a footnote is especially when you're talking about the Islanders, when we make a big deal out of everything. We have a a podcast that goes on for hours about folks like Randy Robitaille and Richard Zednik. Like we will find a way to make a big deal of it. He becomes such a footnote, and I mean, we'll get into why, but that's I mean, I was so excited. I was so excited when they got him, and it didn't work out, and I felt like how it unfolded. Nobody really got to the bottom of it too.
Yeah. This game I do not remember, but I think it's safe to say that this was the highlight of Richard Zednik's.
I want to say Johan Holmquist was in goal for the Lightning with his funny pads.
It was in fact Johan Holmquist. How about that? Wow. How do you I don't even remember that guy.
I remember this season some weird stuff, and I remember him just having those weird pads with like the circles on them basically, and he was terrible.
Rick DiPietro, 36 saves in this game, which is pretty good for him. And
I think this was the game that Rick came back. He had got the concussion.
Oh,
and then he came back and he played in this game, and everyone's like, and he played really well. And then they're like, you probably shouldn't be playing anymore.
I don't think they lost this because it wasn't his fault. But so Zednik scores from Randy Robitaille. The Islanders take the lead on a shorthanded goal by Richard Park from Ryan Smith and Tom Poti. Tom Poti might be the last guy on this team that we end up doing an episode about. And then Miro Shatan from Kozlov and Richard Zednik. So he ends up with a goal and an assist in this game. Again, that the Islanders lost in overtime because they blew that 2-goal lead.
Prime's exclusive wildcard playoff game is Saturday night. Jordan Love and the Packers take on Caleb Williams and the Bears. Not a Prime member? Sign up for a 30-day free trial to stream the game.
That's going to be caught for the touchdown.
NFC North rivals square off in the latest chapter of the NFL's oldest feud. The Packers and Bears in Prime's exclusive wildcard playoff game. Saturday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Only on Prime. Sign up for a 30-day free trial today. Restrictions apply. See Amazon.com/Amazon Prime for details.
We've actually talked about Zednik before on this show. It was back in season 1 with our friend Desmond. We did an episode on the reluctant Euros, the European players that didn't want to come to the Islanders. Some stayed, some didn't. Zednik is one of the guys who didn't. We'll get to that again a little bit later. But something strange happened with Zednik during his time with the Islanders, where his last game was on March 22nd. He kind of had an absence. At the time, I tried to look it up. All it says is that there was a family emergency, and he ended up coming back to play in the playoffs against the Sabres that year, and he played all 5 games in the playoffs, although we didn't have any points for the Islanders. But yeah, he disappeared for about 9 days, and I'm still not 100% sure why. Maybe it was because he didn't think the Islanders were going to make the playoffs. Again, family emergency seemed to be kind of the official line there. Do either of you guys have anything? Ted, do you remember this at all? Is there a reason why he just disappeared for like a couple of weeks?
I mean, it's hard to say with that, because obviously, and I'm sure, like you were saying with the craziness, and I don't know necessarily in this case, but it bleeds down to the locker room. So, if things are messed up, the players certainly know they're messed up. So it just, and the other thing too is you can kind of see, obviously you see the stats after that year. You can definitely see his play was in decline after the lockout. So I'm not sure, maybe that has something to, obviously I'm sure he was frustrated with, having 7 goals that entire season. But it was strange. Like I said, I can't attest to what was going on, but I know obviously, he wasn't an Islander the next year. He wasn't overly productive. And, he might have, clearly it seemed like he wasn't a good fit. And sometimes you have repercussions because of that. You're a player, you get frustrated and you don't want to have to deal with it. And, like I said, players know when things are going weird. And like you were recapping, things were very weird at that time. So
yeah, definitely. Mike, you seem to think that he just noped out on the Islanders because he didn't want to be here anymore.
Well, yeah,
we have no actual evidence of that.
Right. And no, this is anecdotal. This is a memory thing. And look, I did remember, I promise I didn't look up that Johan Holmquist was in goal for that game. I knew that. But I remember the scuttlebutt around the Coliseum was that Zednik, the Islanders had basically abandoned all hope. Like they were not going to make the playoffs. we know the miracle it took for them to get in. And Zednik wasn't producing, and as we said, like kind of just maybe was too much of a good thing to keep collecting all these 90s early aughts players. And he was the, we get Garth Snow's heat check just didn't work out. But he and then he kind of just was gone, and everybody on, if you were a regular on MikeMustGo.com, the forum, everybody was kind of in agreement that he just was like, I'm a free agent next year. Why am I playing? I don't want to get hurt. This team's going nowhere. What's the point? I don't even know these guys. I didn't know Brendan Witt was here, but he is. Like, this is very strange. And so he just went home. And I know that it's probably something that was more serious, and it was necessary for him to leave, but it was just very funny and convenient because, hey, he popped right back up when the playoffs started. He's like, "Oh, you guys made the playoffs? Okay, yeah, I guess I'll play some playoff hockey for you." And the Islanders certainly needed him. That they could have used a player like Zednik. I think he played on the Islanders didn't have any lines that year, right? There was no first line, second line, third line, or fourth line. There was basically just 4 third lines, and so he just fit in on one of the fourth, or one of the third lines. Down the pecking order. I don't think he really had a memorable 5 games against the Sabres, but I think that's what I remember from it, was that he kind of just like disappeared, and there were just rumors that he was like, I got what no skin off my back, I don't want to get hurt, and he ends up he signs a contract afterwards, so maybe it was the right decision. But personally, for him and his financial life after hockey, but it was so strange, and really took the wind out of the sails of the season. Was just a basically 1 week the wind was in your sails, 1 week it was out of your sails, and him getting the trade was certainly a wind in the sails moment, and it came out pretty quickly when he deserted the team, or I shouldn't say that because we don't know what it is, but like when he left the team all those years ago, and so it was a very strange Islander tenure for a player that, like, oh, Richard Zednik, he's an Islander, that's awesome, and then you're like, oh man, like I really wish it worked out. It's I have no ill will towards him for this, because this season had to have this happen. Like it really had to go this way for the season to stay on course, and whatever course it was on, and whatever alternate universe we were living in that year. But so it was a very interesting 10 game plus the playoffs for him, because I was expecting and hoping so much more, and maybe it was just that 8-year-old still in me, like just being like, come on, Zednik, this is so cool. But like I said, I would have traded anything that happened in the season for the world. Anything. It was just so great to live through, looking back on it, because you live through a season like this, you can live through any season as a fan.
Yeah, seriously. But what's funny is that it's, of all the things that happen, like, it just feels like Zednik was just sort of not there. Like, it's kind of a weird thing that he was acquired.
Everything was like had like a domino effect to it. Every little move, like to the point where Todd Simpson abusing an official in Germany ends up having a domino effect that the Islanders then have to go to get Darren Quint instead of him in Europe, right? Like Zednik, the Islanders trading for Richard Zednik didn't. It just was like the only one that didn't really have any sort of like repercussions in a season full of ripple effects. So it's very just strange. Like, very, very strange.
Right. But before we move on to his final NHL stop, we have to discuss what happened to the pick that the Islanders sent to the Capitals. So it was a 2nd round pick, as I said before. And as we found out on this show in previous episodes, these picks tend to get used on players that aren't weird and, and end up having real legacies. And Ted, you brought something to this that I not even know about this pick. So if you look on Hockey Reference, it just says that the Islanders traded a 2nd round pick to the Capitals for Richard Zednik on February 26, 2007, and it was used on a player named Theo Ruth. But that's not where Theo Ruth's story ends, is it?
No, the silver lining for the Islanders is this pick turned into Theo Ruth, who was a national team development player. Never played an NHL game, only played in the American Hockey League in the the ECHL. However, Theo Ruth was traded the next trade deadline to the Columbus Blue Jackets for Sergei Fedorov. And Fedorov, about 15 months later, scores a big goal against the New York Rangers in Game 7 of the 2009 playoffs, and may have made up for 10 games of mediocre Richard Zednik for a lot of Islander fans without even knowing it.
Didn't miss by much. And back comes Sergei Fedorov now. Going wide on Redden. Here's Fedorov, puts on the brakes. Snaps a shot. He scores! Sergei Fedorov has given the Capitals a 2-1 lead.
It was something I didn't even know. I looked it up, and I was saying earlier, he didn't even have a Wikipedia page, so you knew it was a good career. But then you look, who did he get traded for? Oh, some guy named Sergei Fedorov. Okay, so I think that worked out.
Yeah, seriously. That's the highlight of Theo Ruth's career, I guess.
Pretty
getting traded for. I mean, I wouldn't mind being traded for Sergei Fedorov either. That's pretty awesome.
I mean, you think about it, as Zednik got traded for Trevor Linden, Vancouver Canucks legend, and the guy he gets traded for from the Islanders gets traded for a Hall of Famer. That ain't bad.
That is insane. I love this. It's not quite Peter Regan for Igor Shesterkin levels, but it's up there. It's very close. So thank you so much for bringing that, because I never would have known that. But this sets up the final stop in the NHL career of Richard Zednik, which is, as Mike said, he was one of the players that left at the end of the season alongside Ryan Smith, alongside Jason Blake, alongside Victor Kozlov, alongside Tom Poti. All these guys left the Islanders at the end of the season. Of course, they missed the playoffs the next year. So that season was madness, bedlam, lightning in a bottle, whatever you want to call it. Zednik signs with the Florida Panthers. Obviously, this is well before the Panthers won back-to-back cups. Ends up playing 2 seasons for the Panthers. That was okay. He had 15 goals one year, 17 the next. But unfortunately, he had a terrible skate cut that he suffered while he was with Florida from one of his own teammates, Olli Jokinen, who hasn't gotten an episode of this show yet. He will at some point.
The big story Sunday was on the ice in Buffalo, an incident that you never want to see, a hockey player going to the hospital after a very scary play.
Yeah, it's something that you always hate to see, and at the same time, you're always surprised that it doesn't happen more often. With the Sabres leading 4-3, with 9:56 remaining in the third period, Olli Jokinen's skate strikes Richard Zednik in the neck, and it cut him open. He was bleeding profusely. He immediately skated to the Panthers bench where the training staff attended to him. He was then rushed to Buffalo General Hospital where he underwent successful surgery. The Panthers made arrangements for Zednik's wife, Jessica, to be flown to Buffalo on a chartered flight. Now, because of the nature of the incident, we've chosen not to show some of the more graphic video. Assistant GM Randy Sexton and trainer Dave Zanobi chose to stay in Buffalo with Zednik. Obviously, everyone in attendance was shocked and concerned. Bill McCreary, meantime, discussing whether or not to continue the game with senior NHL Vice President Colin Campbell and Sabres General Manager Darcy Regier. They opted to continue. And later on, it would be announced to the crowd in attendance that Zednik was in stable condition. And for that, the fans gave him a standing ovation. Sabres went on to win this one 5-3.
Seemed like a pretty innocent play in the corner. I guess Jokinen kind of got tripped up. His skate came up and it cut Zednik across the throat. He immediately took off for the bench and got a towel around him and was fine. But boy, I remember this, and this was really scary. And it was one of those moments where like the entire hockey world comes together and it's like, holy shit, I hope this guy's okay. Zednik's okay. Because again, this is a guy who'd been in the league for like 15 years at that point. He had made friends in Washington and Montreal, all over the place. And, you never want to see this with anybody, but this was a guy who was a beloved figure. Ted, do you remember this? I had forgotten about this. And then as soon as if you Google Richard Zednik, this is like the first thing that comes up, which is again, kind of sad. And it's gruesome. Don't watch the video if you're squeamish about this kind of stuff. But as soon as I saw it, I was like, holy crap, I remember this. Is this something that jogs your memory and is like, wow, I remember when that happened?
Oh yeah, no. And the weirder thing is, remember, about 20 years before that, former Capital Clint Malarchuk, in a game in Buffalo, got a skate cut to the throat.
Of course. Yeah.
And it basically wasn't the same building, but it was in the same part of the rink. And so that's what immediately what a lot of people I think thought of, because obviously that was a very scary situation. And so is this. I mean, unfortunately, like I was alluding to earlier, I think Zednik's I don't know too if he played such a kind of the skating was such a big part of his game. I don't think it was quite there at the end, so he was not quite as productive. And so I think this is sadly it's the most memorable thing in Florida. And Florida was another team at that point was collecting they were collecting everybody too. Want to come play some golf. It's nice weather. Show up at the rink. We'll be happy. And those are the kind of Florida teams back then. And I think obviously it's terrific. He's okay, but obviously it really reminded me of the Malarchuk incident just because obviously I'd seen that before. And it's a very weird coincidence. The two places it happened was within a couple 100 feet of each other.
Yeah. No, it was pretty brutal, and I don't know. I probably blocked it out. Mike, what about you? This would have been in 2008, basically. So again, right in that wheelhouse for you. I mean, do you remember this incident? This was probably in the early days of YouTube, but I'm sure I don't know if we could say it went viral, but it definitely went around, and feels like I'm pretty sure I watched this on ESPN2 at the time also.
Yeah, I mean, back then it was probably the only hockey thing that they'd ever show. It'd be like something like this. Yeah, I don't know. I remember this very vividly, and I remember talking to people and being like, "Yep, this guy he used to be an Islander." Like Richard Zednik was an Islander, and I'm like, "Yeah, he was an Islander, but that's that's not the point here." But I remember it being very scary. I can remember him holding his neck and skating off and being like, "What the heck?" Like he just saved his own life. Like that guy, like he had like the wherewithal to put the pressure on it, and and it is sad that that's kind of like what people know him for in this generation, but to kind of lighten it up a bit is I agree full throatedly with what Ted was saying about the Panthers back then. Like you think of the Panthers now and like the no state tax thing, and like you'd assume that this team had been built an evil empire, but man, those Panthers teams back then were always so bad, and it was because they made no bones about what you were going to the Florida Panthers to do, which was like just a couple guys will care. Most of the guys just want to be really rich in Florida, and that's awesome. And so you'd have these teams with guys like Radek Dvorak and
Joe Nieuwendyk, Florida Panther. Remember that?
Joe Nieuwendyk. And, they'd come in droves, man. Like these European guys, especially towards the end of their career, and they were always just so bad, and nobody ever went to go watch them, and they were a bit of a laughing stock. But I'm sure that those players would not have traded that for the world. You want to finish? You play in front of what? 8,000 people. Who cares? You're going to finish last in the terrible Southeast Division. Who cares? Because you're just get to be like an anonymous rich guy in South Florida. And I think that there's a lot of guys who would have signed up for that. And I give Mr. Zednik a lot of credit for that. This being the last stop on his career. Like this is a perfect way to, especially a career like he had. You said like he played 700 something NHL games. Go and of course the injury means he didn't really just like ease into retirement, but go ease into retirement in Florida on these terrible Panthers teams. No pressure on you. He did score an amazing goal against the Islanders. I remember.
Yes.
Too, that where he like jumped over Brendan Witt.
Yeah,
and I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Like, of course, Richard Zednik is scoring, and against he's scoring the goal that I thought the Islanders were going to be the type of goals I thought they were going to be getting when they traded for him against the Islanders. Like, it was, so
that goal was amazing. It's like Spider-Man shit. Like he's like literally leaping over a sliding Brendan Witt and just scoring a goal.
Richard Zednik trying to track it down and does. Zednik moves in front, makes a move, and scores! Another beauty by Dr. Z at work again. And it's 3-1 Florida. What a play by Zednik.
I'll tell you what, give him marks for his hurdles. Give him marks for driving to the net. Just give him great marks for scoring a huge goal, timely one for the Florida Panthers. Wow, just self-explanatory there. Take a look at it. Yes, look at that. Whoa.
How everybody on the ice at that moment didn't just get up and retire, I have absolutely no idea.
I know.
It's unbelievable.
Or us. Like, I was like, how is this happening? Like, this guy played it made no impact for us, and he's now jumping over Brendan Witt and scoring on the play. And I can almost picture myself back then being like, "Oh my god!" Like watching him jump and be like, "Well, he's not going to score, and this isn't going to be a goal. I'm going to have to relive a million times on highlight shows." And yep, nope, there he is. He's doing it.
No.
In those Panthers, those Navy Panthers jerseys back then too, like with the piping, and it was the Panthers were not they weren't the team that they were now. So very different Florida Panthers that Richard Zednik played for compared to Matthew Tkachuk.
Yeah, seriously. But yeah, so 2 years with the Panthers. That was his final stop. His final NHL career numbers: 745 games played, around 200 goals, which I respect greatly. 179 assists for 379 points. 2 stints with Washington, with Montreal, the Islanders, and Panthers. Again, his most games played, most goals, most assists, all came with Montreal, which is kind of surprising to me. But he was part of that 98 Eastern Conference champion run with the Caps. And his final Islanders tally: 10 games, 1 goal, 2 assists, 3 points. In an insane season, he somehow managed to fly under the radar. But that was not the end of Richard Zednik's playing career, because he did go back to Europe. He played in Sweden for a while. He played in Slovakia, his home country. And in one final footnote, and again, we should note that Richard Zednik is very much alive and well right now. He does interviews, and he's still as sharp as ever. He's got a lot of great stories and stuff. But in 2012, he was skating with youth players in Slovakia, in his home country, when the arena's roof collapsed. And it just barely missed him, apparently. And so this stuff just tends to find him a little bit. But yeah, it's an interesting legacy. I mean, Ted, when you think about Richard Zednik, obviously you're a guy who's spent a lot of time watching the Caps. Like, if you had to kind of sum up his NHL career, like, what would it be? I mean, you've been saying like he's a guy who had wheels, maybe not the finishing ability, but was a productive player. And actually, you used a movie illustration before we came on that I thought was actually quite funny, and I wouldn't have thought of him that way, but you do.
It's basically, I called him the Forrest Gump. He basically, like I was saying earlier, he showed up at the key moments. He was there at the last game at the old building in Landover. He was there for the opening of the new building. He was there for the finals. After that, the Caps weren't particularly great, and neither was he. But yeah, no, I think he basically, he wasn't a consistent player, but kind of had a flair for the moment. Right. When the moments are big, perhaps that was the thing with the Islanders too. They obviously, he'd played in Montreal, played in Washington, and then he played in Washington, which wasn't quite what he left before, and then he's going to the Islanders. So probably not the most enthusiastic season he'd had, but when the moments are big, he tended to show up.
Yeah.
Obviously not in orange and blue, but he did. And I think his legacy too. Those the Capitals team obviously made the finals, so I think the legacy is a little bit more with Washington, just because he was part of those playoff teams where he had regular season success in Montreal, but not necessarily the playoff success.
Yeah. But no, it's a shame. And I mean, what you I'm sure you talked to Caps fans today. Like, do they have any like sort of fond memories? Is he a guy? I mean, obviously they've won a Stanley Cup since he's retired, and they've had a host of other great players. Like, is he a guy who still has like a lot of fans amongst the Capitals faith?
I think I was telling you before, there was a Zedhead night in Washington, right? Before it's during his first stint. It actually was the season he was traded, but a local radio station had a deal. If you basically bleached your hair like Zednik, they would give you a free ticket and a jersey. And so I think 100 fans signed up. And like I was telling you, with the big moments, he got his first career hat trick against the Detroit Red Wings, who they hadn't beaten in years. So, that's basically what he was. He showed up when he wanted to, but when he did, he could make a big impact.
That's funny. That's cool. Ted, this has been great. You have delivered as I expected on your expertise on Richard Zednik. So, I mean, you're writing at Hockey Hot Stove. Where else can everybody find your work? How often do you write there? And I mean, are you mainly covering the Capitals, or is it just NHL in general?
League-wide. I'm doing, basically I do a weekly column. It's been Capitals for right now, because they're, kind of looking for more Capitals writers. And obviously, Caps are kind of in my wheelhouse. But I'm doing stuff at UBS this year. And maybe a little bit more with the Visitors, just, it's not nothing. I get nothing with the Islanders. It's just the way my regular job works. It's a little bit easier to work it out. So
we are recording this towards the tail end of October. Actually, on the anniversary of Zedhead Night, as you were saying, it was a Halloween game, and he scored that night.
Yes, I forgot to mention it. Yes, I was going to say 25 years ago, this Halloween 2025 was Zedhead Night. So it's probably one of the greater promotions they've ever had, and not a bad deal. You get a ticket in New Jersey for just bleaching your hair and looking like Sugar Ray for a while.
That's oh my God, please don't bring up Sugar Ray, one of my all-time most hated bands. But thanks again, Ted. We really appreciate you coming on. I hope you have a good time.
Oh, I look, as I said, big fan, glad to be on, and I'm happy to be on. And if you ever do a Tom Pody or any other marginal capitals, I'm happy to be here.
Oh boy, am I glad to hear you say
Pody.
that. All right,
Yeah,
I am penciling you in for the Tom Pody episode, because that's another guy I've been waiting to get on for. So expect an email for the next few months.
Oh yeah. That's why when you brought him up, I instantly thought of that. I said, well, if you want me back, I'm happy to talk about him too.
Perfect. Love when that works out. That's great. Thank you very much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Thanks,
become
man.
a member of patreon.com/Islanders Anxiety for ad-free episodes, bonus podcasts, written posts, and chats, or just join for free to get our weekly release calendar or try a free 7-day trial. Our theme song is Knuckles by, let me try that again. Our theme song is Knuckles by Bjorn Falk. Listen to more of Bjorn's music on Bandcamp and on Spotify. Read Lighthouse Hockey every single day for your most up-to-date Islanders news and discussion. Islanders Anxiety podcasts are part of the Fans First Sports Network. Find us wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Please leave us a review where you can. Shop at VintageIceHockey.com. Try wines from the Pinot Project. Mike, any final thoughts on Richard Zednik? Extremely weird Islander, but sort of a legend for 3 other teams. I don't know if we've had a guy who you can say that about on this show.
Yeah, no, I think what's really sticking out here is that he was tailor-made to be a cult hero, trade deadline acquisition for whatever team got him, and I would have been jealous of any other team that acquired him that year. And in a season, in a roster full of guys who end up becoming cult heroes and folk legends and of all sorts for Islander fans, it is so on the nose for this season that Richard Zednik ends up just making absolutely zero impact on the Islanders. So, a perfect fit for. He was a terrible fit and a perfect fit at the same time for the 2006-07 Islanders, which is a team we will continue to go back to the well on because there's just still so much here to get into.
Seriously. Yeah, no, that you nailed it as always. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another great guest and another weird Islander. Until then, keep the Islanders weird. We will talk to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.